I just want to thank you, both of you, for really setting this space up and helping us to understand like what we mean when we say justice and how that looks in the clinical field. Now we can talk about how the church can respond, but first I would like to stay just right here to talk about what it means for us to just be the church. What are we doing when we say we're going to be the church, particularly from a parish ministry perspective, right? Before we even get to this slide, just thinking about what it means for the church to decide that we are going to do justice, specifically those who call ourselves disciples, followers of Jesus. So one of the things that I think we have to orient ourselves toward is thinking about whether or not our actions or lack of actions reflect what principles we have picked up in our study of who we claim to follow, right? And so that means it doesn't leave space for just this soft, mushy understanding of love as justice, just this kind of, oh, you are so sweet and I love you and Jesus loves you too. But it's also not treating justice as this kind of nebulous concept that we can't really reach, that's out there in the future. But it's about working on the ground to really close the gaps in access, to really address those disparities, to address the systems and structures that are in place that put people's life at harm. And we are in a very unique position in terms of us as the church, us as people sitting in pews Sunday after Sunday, learning a particular set of concepts, right? Because we're sitting in pews with other people. And so there are 2 points on the slide that actually I've switched up the way I'm going to talk about them. So the first two can just come together if we can work that out. So the first 2 ways that I think we have as people inside the churches, unique opportunities to set up the really difficult work of addressing imbalances, disparities in the ways our systems inscribe themselves on our individual selves, right? The first that I want to address is it is a theological concept. Seeing is a theological concept. Accepting that we are looking at another child of God, whether or not they're sitting in our pews, whether or not they believe anything that we believe, we have got to first intentionally learn to really see each other. We've become a society of shorthands and labels that tell us how to identify them. And then once we've identified people, we label them, and that's how we decide to treat them. That is not, that's also systemic. So I'm not trying to point fingers at people and say, you over there are doing this. We all fall kind of under this umbrella of this thing, right? And so, but in the church, we have a unique opportunity to kind of try to help folks change that perspective. We've also been trained sometimes that just some folks don't matter as much. It's unfortunate, but there's a way in which we have been taught by little things over the course of centuries that not everybody matters the same. And we say out loud that we know everybody matters the same to God, but then we allow ourselves to continue to use these shorthands. So the challenge for us as the church, as we have modeled in Jesus, is to push past the shorthand, the labels, and see the people, see the humanity of every people. Let's think about it. If in John 8, Jesus had accepted the label adulteress in society's prescription for what was supposed to happen to the woman in that story, then a woman would have died unnecessarily that day, right? But when we accept those labels in shorthand for marginalized groups without seeing them as full human beings with their own complexities, what we're doing is we're handing over the power over their lives to the very systems that at the very least don't really consider all that it takes to invest in their well-being. And at the very worst, have identified some labels as worth punishment, right? These are the ways in which the connection between kind of how we understand things in our own personal space impact the lives of people through systems. But when we continue to let that happen, that shows up in different ways. Workplace discrimination against people with mental illness, extra vulnerability to criminal justice systems. There is a whole webinar on that on the NBA website. I offer you the opportunity to check into that. Social marginalization. We do, when we accept the label that this over here means this kind of behavior, and so we choose to avoid people, that also actually participates in this systemic thing that decides that other people, some people, are not worth showing up for, right? And so the more negative, we've talked about intersectionality, we've talked about everything I'm talking about. I am hoping that I am putting feet on it so that we can see it from all sides, 360 view, right? So we talked about intersectionality, and a less fancy understanding of intersectionality is the more labels with negative connotations that we allow people to have to walk around with, the more negative impacts on them from individuals, institutions, and whole systems are compounded. So every time we allow somebody to slap a label on somebody else that actually diminishes them, the more that we give permission, because we give permission to systems to do the things they do, right? Either by telling them to do them or by being silent when they continue to do them, right? We can't effectively be the church in the fight for justice regarding mental health without being intentional about training ourselves to see people before we interact with labels, right? The next step is, or they really work hand in hand, is listening. While we're seeing people, while we're deciding, I'm not going to see that young Black man across the street talking to himself as dangerous just because they told me that he's dangerous, we also might want to listen, right? We have biblical understanding of that too. There's a woman in Matthew 15 comes to Jesus asking for help. He rejects her because basically she's beneath him. And she comes back and says, well, no, don't even the dogs get some help when they need some help, right? And Jesus changes Jesus's own mind about helping her because he hears her. He decides to listen and he hears her and he understands differently. And the systems and some of the institutions that intervene in the lives of folk living with mental health issues like to talk about mental health issues without paying attention to the lived experience of people living with mental health issues, right? But here's the rub. It's only, particularly as the church, we are in such a unique opportunity moment, right? Because we have access to the people. We have access to hear and amplify the stories of the people. And that's how we can see the intersections of various oppressions. And we can see the full array of the abuses visited on the lives of the people. So we talked about intersectionality. We talked about disparities in diagnosis and treatment. However, there is something to be said for listening to the young man who has been criminalized or diagnosed more aggressively than others, because by listening to him, we might learn how difficult it is to get and keep health care that he needs in order to be treated consistently and compassionately. And we might learn about the ways in which the criminal record created by the lack of access to treatment in the first place affects his job prospects, pushing him further away from options for consistent treatment because he lives in Tennessee, where healthcare is barely available anyway, right? Now, if we take it on ourselves to amplify the vicious cycle of his experience, that might help broaden the conversation around mental health services access in general, as well as disparities in diagnosis and treatment. We have the ability to lift up those stories that impact the people who make the decisions on how the systems work. Perhaps when we talk to the Spanish-speaking woman who has lost custody of her children because of behavior that we've been taught to think of as criminal before considering the need for medical intervention, we might hear the story of her wanting help, looking for help, but being unable to successfully navigate the systems to find access due to the language barrier, or due to just not understanding the systems, or due to fear of deportation for somebody she loves if she encounters the system, right? Amplification of this experience might broaden the conversation around mental health education and barriers to access that might seem a little less concrete when we're looking from afar on first look, but are fully functioning barriers in the lived experiences of traditionally marginalized people. And ultimately, as the church, it's our willingness and ability to see and hear what is actually happening in the lives of the people in our pews and communities that help us operate best in the power of that has the most potential to impact systems and institutions, right? And what's that power for us as the church? In a lot of moments, that power is simply our voices. So this is important for us to understand because we really are. We've talked a lot about what the systems do to individuals. However, the reality is what our power lies in what we can do to shift the systems and the institutions. And the reality is that in a lot of these communities, we are trusted messengers. We are people that folks come to for advice. And I'm not talking about just folks in the community who are struggling. I'm talking about getting calls from legislators for advice on how to approach topics, getting calls from folks who are running corporations, asking for advice. We're talking in particular regions like the South, really, a particular type of faith voice as legitimacy to whatever plan or action people are undertaking. And so we might not think about it on a day-to-day basis as power, but this really is our power. After a few years working on policy in Tennessee and across and DC, what I know for sure, good or ill, is that a faith voice carries a different kind of weight in the conversation. So it's imperative that those of us who seek change in the systems and institutions that cause harm to people with mental health issues or limit equitable access to treatment or create disparities in diagnosis speak out. We are trusted messengers in our community. That's one of the main sources of our power. And using that voice can look a lot of ways. And so on the next slide, I would like to invite all of our conversation partners back into the room and let us kind of look at these spaces where the church, being the church by using its voice, using its authority, so to speak, for lack of a better word, can be present in ways that help to work toward reorienting these systems and our churches in themselves as institutions.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you want to go first. I have a few thoughts, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to go first on the very first one, which is
yes.
So addressing assumptions, remembering that the church too is an institution that can be, just like any other institution, its structure can sometimes be as hurtful as it is helpful. That our internal work is to address the assumptions we have about mental health and then about other marginalized folks and about those intersections. And we do that by doing stuff like this, right? Educational opportunities and that kind of thing. Now, I am sweating, so I'm going to be quiet for like 30 seconds.
I appreciate that because I think after hearing you talk about labels, it just sparked, I know in the clinical field, some of the tension that we even have with the church because of the assumptions that the church historically has and the way in which we label, you know, historically through our own theology. And so I think this is a great segue for me, at least, into lifting up populations that have been systemically marginalized within our communities. And how do we, you know, those, in my mind, there are many. The three that stand out, I know as a clinician, are definitely our LGBTQI community in terms of being deemed as sexually sinful in ways that teach us as possibly Christians that somehow their mental health doesn't matter or their life doesn't matter. That was perpetuated in the diagnosing early on in our DSMs, where it being, you know, not heterosexual was an actual disorder. And that's changed, thank God, since then. But this is something systemically that through our faith we've perpetuated. I think about felons and what it means to be, you know, having had a felony, now somehow you're eternally sinful and therefore you don't matter in that way. And then people of other religions, the idea you had mentioned, if they don't believe like us, then somehow we don't serve them. And so not proposing those three populations is a group of people that we as the church probably should and are doing some reworking of how we our assumptions about those people and what does it mean that we serve them, you know, as a realms of just in general, but also through mental health. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. We can go through some of these other
Well, so this is one of those spaces where I'm always very careful because I have views that are considered radical among some of my colleagues, right? But the reality is that still takes us back to reteaching ourselves to see every person as a child of God, as a human being, and starting there first, right? But that's a process that we really do have to start reteaching. And so that would be my address from parish ministry perspective. I'm interested to hear what Shonda would have to say about that.
So this is really interesting. First of all, because some of these systemic injustice things that we've absorbed into the culture of the church, therefore stop us from being able to support and love and journey with people who are dealing with mental health issues. And, you know, you were talking about kind of the diagnosis of being LGBTQ used to be a disorder, right, within the mental health profession. And one of the signifiers of that disorder was melancholy. So people who were gay and depressed couldn't get help for real depression because that was dismissed as part of, well, that's because you're gay. Mm-hmm. And the ways in which those systemically embedded biases show up throughout the history of mental health are really challenging to our work as the church. I had mentioned to both of you previously, and I'd like to mention to everybody on the call, there is a book called The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, that I highly recommend. It came out about 6 years ago. It talks about how schizophrenia had been in the DSM in the 1950s generally described as a disease that afflicted white housewives who were generally of a good demeanor. And so the notion of schizophrenia was gentle people who had breaks with reality. In the 1960s, as the Black Power movement emerges, as Black rage becomes an articulated experience, all of a sudden the diagnosis shifts so that schizophrenia is now a dangerous disease attached to Black men who are expressing their experience of the racial injustice of society. Interestingly enough, this study was done in the late 1960s in the Ionia State Hospital in northeastern Michigan. A friend of mine lived near there and said, it is now a federal supermax prison because of the criminalization of a changing, evolving mental health condition. Now, all of that said, I wanted to talk very briefly about my own experience at First Christian Church of Oakland, where we wrestled with some of those intersectional issues ourselves. The church, just before I got there, had given a parking permission to the foster home behind our building, because the church folks said, we need young people in the church. So if we give them access to our parking, the youth will join our church. That did not automatically happen. So once I got there, we started building up relationships. What we found was it was a foster home for LGBT youth in the community. And we had to do some thinking about what it meant to be the church in relation to the people who God had put in our backyard. Mm-hmm. And we had a Christmas decorating party for them, Christmas tree decorating party for them, had them come over. Some of them are decorating the tree. One kid's sitting in the corner sullenly. And we say, why don't you want to decorate the tree? And he said, I'm a pagan. And God bless one of the chaplains who was a member of our church. He said, so's the Christmas tree. And the kid's eyes got wide and he said, yeah, but Christians don't know that. And so it was this moment of breaking through that big barrier. Over the course of our years of building up relationships with them, we began to realize many of them had families nearby who would take them on Sunday to church with them, but wouldn't let them live under their roof because their condition, their parents would have said, was sinful. Many of them were dealing with mental health issues. And many of them were, in addition to being LGBTQ, were also people of color in a society that had limited their options considerably. They were dealing with poverty, they were dealing with race, they were dealing with orientation, they were dealing with mental health issues. And so they had all of those labels hanging on their shoulders. So that issue of listening and seeing was so critical to our church in order to recognize the ways in which the systems that we exist within was really harming them. And without being aware of those systems, we would never have been able to support them through the mental health crises they were facing.